The projector hummed, a low, mechanical drone that seemed to vibrate right through the mahogany table and into my bones. The air in the morbidity and mortality conference room was always aggressively cold, smelling faintly of burnt coffee and fear. But today it felt personal. At the head of the table, Chief of Surgery Dr. Vance wasn't looking at the patient files or the projected vitals. He was looking at me. His gaze was heavy, predatory, a weight that settled right in the center of my chest. My career hung on this review, on the next 10 minutes, but my traitorous eyes kept drifting past him to Dr. Elena Acker, the woman who held my future, and my heart, in her surgical hands. The room went dead silent as Vance flipped the file open. To the rest of St. Jude's, Dr. Acker was a monolith. They called her the Ice Queen behind her back, though never within earshot of her terrifyingly acute hearing. She moved through the corridors like a scalpel, precise, cold, severing unnecessary noise from the signal. When she spoke during rounds, residents stopped breathing, terrified that a single misplaced exhale would draw her critical gaze. She was the architecture of silence itself, a woman built of protocols, perfect sutures, and a terrifying competence that made grown men stumble over their words. I had watched her dismantle a senior attending's ego with 3 sentences and a raised eyebrow just last week. She was untouchable. But I knew the truth that lived behind that fortress. I knew the way her breath hitched when she was truly exhausted. A soft, vulnerable sound that she would die before letting the hospital hear. I knew she didn't drink the cafeteria sludge unless she was desperate. She preferred a specific dark roast she ground herself at 5 a.m., the scent of it clinging to her hair like a promise. I knew the warmth that radiated off her skin when the armor came off, and the specific scent of sandalwood and rain that lingered on her sheets. Watching her sit there now, spine steel straight, face unreadable, was an exercise in torture. Because 3 hours ago, that same face had been pressed against the hollow of my neck, softer than anyone here would believe possible. Our relationship was a ghost in the machine of the hospital. Undefined, unspoken. A series of open loops that tightened every time we were in the same room. We existed in the negative space between professional boundaries. A brushed hand during a chart transfer, a lingering look over a mask in the OR, a foot nudging mine under the table in the cafeteria. It was a dangerous game, playing house in a burning building, but the pull was undeniable. It wasn't just attraction, it was a magnetic north I couldn't recalibrate. Just yesterday, the tension had nearly snapped us both. We were in the scrub room, prepping for a routine cholecystectomy. The automatic sinks were hissing, the smell of antiseptic sharp and chemical in the air. I was scrubbing up to my elbows, the rough sponge scraping skin that felt too sensitive, when Acker stepped in. The door clicked shut, sealing us in that small, tiled box. The air instantly changed. It thickened, charged with a static that made the hair on my arms stand up. She didn't speak. She just moved to the sink beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat of her body through her scrubs. She reached for the soap, her arm brushing mine, a contact that lasted maybe half a second, but felt like a lightning strike. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, water running over my hands, waiting for her to pull away, to correct the proximity. She didn't. She stayed right there, invading my personal space with a deliberate, terrifying confidence. The sound of the water seemed to fade, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thud of my own heart. "Focus, Dr. Vance," she had murmured, her voice low, dropping under the hum of the ventilation. Not Ilara, not Honey. Dr. Vance. The professional title made the intimacy of her tone hit harder. She turned her head slightly, her eyes locking onto mine in the reflection of the stainless steel dispenser. The look wasn't cold, it was possessive. It was a claim staked in the middle of a sterile zone. "You're distracted." "I'm not," I had lied, my voice sounding thin, barely audible. "You are, She had turned off the water with a sharp motion of her knee. "Fix it, or I will." She had left then, leaving me shaking, dripping wet, and more turned on than was remotely appropriate for a place of healing. That was the dynamic. She pushed, I pulled, and we pretended the friction wasn't creating sparks that could burn the whole place down. But the scrub room was a sanctuary compared to the boardroom. In there, the tension was private, a secret language only we spoke. Out here, with Vance watching my every micro-expression, the hospital politics were becoming impossible to ignore. The silence that usually protected us was starting to feel less like a shield and more like a cage. Chief Vance didn't just walk through the hospital wings. He patrolled them, marking territory with the heavy click of his Italian loafers and the suffocating cloud of bespoke cologne that announced his arrival 3 seconds before he appeared. He was a man built of old money and older prejudices, the kind of surgeon who believed pedigree was a vital sign, as measurable and critical as a pulse. To him, my presence in his program wasn't an achievement of merit. It was a statistical error. I was a scholarship hire, a diversity of background candidate who had scraped and clawed my way up from a zip code Vance wouldn't drive through with his windows down. He looked at my off-the-rack scrubs and my scuffed shoes like they were a congenital defect, something to be managed, perhaps, but never cured. His campaign against me hadn't been a sudden explosion. It was more like a slow-acting toxin, administered in microdoses of public humiliation and administrative sabotage. He had decided weeks ago that my temperament was unsuited for the high-altitude thin air of his surgical wing. He called it a lack of focus. He called it emotional volatility. I called it being exhausted from working double shifts to prove I belonged in the same room as his hand-picked favorites from Ivy League incubators. But the narrative he was building was dangerous because it was intangible. You can fight a claim of incompetence with test scores and successful sutures. You can't fight a claim that you just don't have the right sort of character. The breaking point had come 2 days ago during grand rounds. We were clustered around bed 4 in the ICU, a post-op valve replacement that was showing signs of instability. The air was thick with the smell of betadine and the rhythmic, anxious beeping of the monitors. Vance held the chart like a scepter, his eyes scanning the vitals with a bored detachment that made my teeth ache. "The output is dropping," Vance had announced, looking over his reading glasses at the phalanx of residents. "Who can tell me why?" "Hypovolemia," a second-year resident named Brad said instantly. Brad, whose father played golf with Vance. Brad, who had never had to worry about the cost of a textbook in his life. "Standard post-op fluid shift," Vance nodded, reaching for his pen to sign off. "Increase the fluids." "No," I said. The word was out of my mouth before I could filter it through the necessary layers of deference. Vance stopped. The pen hovered over the chart. He turned to me slowly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes stretching across his face. "Dr. Alara disagrees." How refreshing. "Please, enlighten us with your intuition." "It's not intuition," I said, my voice steady despite the sudden spike in my heart rate. I stepped forward, pointing to the monitor. "Look at the CVP. It's climbing, not falling, and his neck veins are distended. It's not hypovolemia. It's tamponade. If you push fluids, you'll kill him." The silence that followed was absolute. Brad shifted uncomfortably. Vance stared at me, his eyes narrowing as he processed the correction. He checked the patient's neck. He checked the monitor. I was right. The signs were subtle, but they were there. A fluid bolus would have collapsed the heart. "Tamponade," Vance repeated flatly. He didn't thank me. He didn't acknowledge the save. Instead, he took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly on his silk tie. "You're very intense, Dr. Alara. Very high-strung. You jumped to that conclusion with a level of panic that is frankly disturbing in a surgeon." "I didn't jump," I argued, keeping my hands clasped behind my back to hide the tremor. I observed. You reacted, Vance corrected, his voice dropping to that patronizing register he reserved for staff he considered help. You see shadows where there are none, because you are looking for disaster. It's a common trait in people from unstable backgrounds. You lack the necessary detachment. You're too focused on the fear, not the medicine. He turned back to the group, dismissing me entirely. Book the OR for a washout. Brad, you scrub in. I stood there, blood boiling under my skin, humiliated despite being right. I risked a glance across the circle. Dr. Acker was leaning against the back wall, her arms crossed over her chest. She hadn't said a word. She hadn't stepped in to defend me. To the room, she looked bored, perhaps even in agreement with Vance's assessment. But I knew her. I knew the specific tension in her jaw meant she was grinding her teeth. I knew the way her eyes tracked Vance's hand on the chart was predatory. Her gaze met mine for a fraction of a second, unflinching, hard, and terrifyingly clear. Hold the line, it said. Don't you dare break. The pressure was building, a physical weight pressing against the back of my neck. Vance was winning. He was painting a picture of me as a frantic, emotional liability, and every time I tried to defend myself, I just added more color to his canvas. I needed an escape. I needed a moment where the only thing that mattered was the work, not the politics. But the hospital doesn't give you what you need. It gives you what you can handle. And the real test wasn't the morning rounds. It was what happened when the sun went down. The hospital changes when the clock strikes 3. The frantic energy of the day shift bleeds out, leaving behind a sterile, humming stillness that feels almost underwater. The fluorescent lights seem to buzz at a lower frequency, and the corridors stretch out into impossible, gleaming distances. It's a time when the boundary between life and death feels thinnest, but also the only time the hierarchy dissolves just enough to let you breathe. I had retreated to the surgical viewing gallery, a darkened room overlooking the empty operating theater 1. It was my hiding spot, the one place where the air didn't smell like judgment. I was leaning my forehead against the cold glass, watching the shadows stretch across the empty tables below, when the door hissed open behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The air in the room shifted, the molecules rearranging themselves to accommodate her gravity. Dr. Acker didn't walk. She arrived. "You're hiding," she said. Her voice was stripped of its daytime command, rougher around the edges, worn down by 14 hours of perfection. "I'm thinking," I corrected, though I didn't lift my head from the glass. Dangerous habit. She moved up beside me, close enough that the scent of her, that specific, grounding mix of antiseptic soap and warm skin, overwrote the smell of floor wax. She wasn't looking at the OR. She was looking at me, her gaze dark and unreadable in the low light of the gallery monitors. "Vance is going to file a formal complaint," I said quietly, the fear I'd been swallowing all day finally bubbling up. "He's building a case, Elena. He's going to say I'm reckless, that I'm a liability." "He's going to try," she agreed. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell me it would be okay. That wasn't her way. She dealt in anatomies, in hard truths. "He smells blood in the water. He thinks you're weak because you feel things. He thinks empathy is a tremor in the hand." "Maybe he's right," I whispered. My hands were shaking, but they didn't stop, she murmured. Then she moved. It was a small gesture, professional on the surface, but devastating in the quiet dark. She reached out and took my left arm, turning my wrist over to expose the tender blue-violet bruise blooming on the inside of my forearm, a souvenir from wrestling a gurney earlier that afternoon. Her fingers were cool, precise. She traced the edge of the bruise with her thumb, a touch so light it felt like a phantom limb. It wasn't a medical exam. It was a caress disguised as triage. "Does this hurt?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave, vibrating in the small space between us. "No," I lied. My breath hitched as her thumb circled the sensitive skin. The connection was electric, a live wire grounding me to the floor. "Liar," she whispered. She didn't let go. Instead, she stepped closer, invading my space with that terrifying, wonderful confidence. Her other hand came up, not to touch, but to hover near the collar of my scrubs, straightening a fold that didn't need straightening. "You carry the stress here," she murmured, her knuckles brushing the hollow of my throat. "Like you're waiting for the blow." "I am," I admitted, my eyes fluttering shut. "I'm waiting for him to destroy me." "He can't," she said, and the sudden steel in her voice made my eyes snap open. She was staring at me with a ferocity that stole the air from my lungs. "He thinks he understands power. He thinks power is lineage and volume. He doesn't know anything about survival." She let go of my wrist and reached for the hem of her own scrub top, pulling the left sleeve up past her elbow. I knew what was there, but seeing it always stopped my heart. A jagged, silvery map of scar tissue ran from her elbow to her shoulder, a legacy of a car accident 10 years ago that should have ended her career. It was ugly and brutal, and the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, because it was the proof that she had rebuilt herself from ruin. "I didn't get this seat because I was perfect, Ilara," she said, guiding my hand to the scar. My fingers trembled as I touched the raised, uneven skin. It was warm, alive. "I got it because when I broke, I learned how to weld the pieces back together stronger than the original iron. Vance has never been broken. That's his weakness. He doesn't know how to heal because he's never had to." She leaned in, her forehead resting against mine, her hand trapping my fingers against her scar. "You aren't weak because you feel the cut. You're strong because you keep stitching anyway." For a moment, the hospital didn't exist. Vance didn't exist. There was only the heat of her skin, the rough texture of her scar under my fingertips, and the terrifying realization that I was the only person allowed to see this map of her pain. We existed in a bubble of safety, suspended in the amber of 3 a.m. Then, the shrill, rhythmic scream of the trauma pager on her hip shattered the silence like a dropped scalpel. The bubble burst. The warmth vanished. In a split second, the lover was gone, and the lead surgeon was back. "Multi-car pileup," she said, reading the text, her voice already cold, already moving. "Let's go." The transition from the hushed intimacy of the viewing gallery to the trauma bay was like stepping out of a decompression chamber directly into a hurricane. The air downstairs didn't smell like floor wax. It smelled of copper, diesel fuel from the paramedics' gear, and the sharp, acidic tang of sheer panic. The pileup on I-95 had sent us 3 criticals in 6 minutes. The bay was a riot of controlled violence. Shouting nurses, the ripping of Velcro straps, the high-pitched alarms of monitors fighting for dominance. But in the center of the storm, Dr. Acker became something else entirely. She wasn't the vulnerable woman who had just let me touch her scars. She was a general. "OR1 is prepped," she barked, her voice cutting through the din without raising in pitch. She pointed at me, her finger snapping out with lethal precision. "Ilara, you're with me. Abdominal blunt force, potential liver laceration. We move now." We moved. We ran alongside the gurney, hands already pressing on the patient's abdomen to stem the internal tide, shouting vitals to the anesthesiologist. The doors to the operating theater swung open, and the world shrank down to the sterile blue field of the surgical drapes. Under the unforgiving glare of the halogen lights, we were a single organism. I knew the specific angle she liked for the retractor before she asked. She knew I would have the suction ready before she saw the blood. It was a dance, a perfect, silent cadence of metal and movement. My hands moved in sync with hers, anticipating, reacting. A choreography of survival that felt more intimate than anything we could ever do in a bedroom. "Scalpel," she said. "Here," I answered, the instrument already in her palm. We worked through the layers of trauma, the rhythm, hypnotic. Snap. Cut. Bovie. Suction. It was going well. The liver was damaged, but salvageable. We were winning. And then the rhythm broke. Pressure is bottoming out, the anesthesiologist announced, his voice tight. 50/30. I'm losing him. Blood welled up from behind the liver, dark and fast. A venous bleed, terrifying in its volume. The suction gurgled, overwhelmed. I can't see the source, Acker said, her voice tight. Pack it. We need to stabilize. It's the retrohepatic cava, I said. I couldn't see it either, but my hand was deep in the abdomen, and I could feel the tear, a jagged rip pulsing against my fingertips. Packing won't hold it, Elena. He'll bleed out before we get him to ICU. Protocol is to pack and transfer for vascular, Acker said, her eyes meeting mine over the mask. They were wide, searching. If we explore and miss, he dies on the table. If we pack, he dies in the elevator, I countered. The monitors were screaming now, a chaotic symphony of failure. I could feel the life draining out of him under my hand. I knew the anatomy. I knew the risk. I can clamp it. I have the angle. You don't have visualization, she warned. It's a blind clamp. I can feel it, I insisted. Trust me. Time suspended. In that fraction of a second, the hierarchy dissolved. It wasn't an attending and a resident, it was just us. She looked at me, really looked at me, searching for the panic Vance said I was full of. She didn't find it. She found the focus she knew I had. Do it, she whispered. I didn't hesitate. I slid the vascular clamp down along the curve of my fingers, guiding it by touch alone into the dark well of blood. I felt the vessel, the tear, the anatomy I had memorized until it was part of my own body. I closed the clamp. Click. The sound was small, but it echoed like a gunshot. We waited. 1 second. 2. Pressure is rising, the anesthesiologist breathed, disbelief coloring his tone. 70/40. Bleeding has stopped. I exhaled, my knees suddenly weak. I looked up. Acker was watching me, her eyes crinkling at the corners, the ghost of a smile she couldn't show. We had saved him. But as I withdrew my hand, I realized what I had done. I had performed a blind vascular maneuver without a consult, deviating from every protocol written in the hospital bylaws. The patient lived, but I had just handed Vance the gun he needed to shoot me. Adrenaline is a loan shark. It gives you the energy you need in the moment, but the interest rates are predatory, and eventually the collection agents come knocking. When the high of the save finally evaporated, it left me hollowed out, shivering in the break room with a cup of coffee that tasted like battery acid and regret. The sun that rose over the city skyline wasn't the triumphant gold of a new day. It was a harsh, interrogator's gray that exposed every smudge on the windows and every crack in my resolve. I had saved a life. I knew that. The patient was stable in the ICU, his vitals strong, his family weeping with relief in the waiting room. But in the sterile ecosystem of St. Jude's, the outcome matters less than the method, and I had just violated the cardinal rule of the institution. I had made the chief of surgery irrelevant. The summons didn't come with fanfare. It was a simple page, 3 words that made my stomach drop through the floor. Vance, office, now. Walking to his office felt like a funeral march for my own career. The administrative wing was carpeted, quiet, insulated from the blood and noise of the trauma bay. It was a world of mahogany and ego. When I entered, Vance raised his eyes, devoid of anger but holding a terrifying, pitying disappointment. "Dr. Alara," he said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Do you know what a cowboy is in surgical terms?" "Someone who takes unnecessary risks," I answered, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Someone who relies on luck because they lack discipline," he corrected. "You got lucky last night. You stuck a clamp into a blind field and you hit the vessel. A millimeter to the left and you would have severed the hepatic artery. A millimeter to the right and you would have crushed the bile duct. You didn't perform surgery. You played Russian roulette with a man's life. He would have died if I waited, I argued, the memory of the blood pulsing against my hand still vivid. The protocol would have killed him. Protocol exists to protect the patient from the arrogance of residents who think they are gods, Vance snapped, his veneer of calm cracking. You are emotionally unstable, Alara. You thrive on the chaos. You mistake panic for intuition, and frankly, I cannot have that kind of volatility in my program. He dismissed me without waiting for a response. But the damage was done. The accusation of emotional instability was a brand, a specific weapon used to turn passion into pathology. I spent the rest of the day in a fugue state of isolation. Rumors move faster than viruses in a hospital, and by noon, everyone knew. I caught the side eyes from the nurses, the hushed whispers of the other residents. Did you hear? She went rogue. She almost killed him. The narrative was already being rewritten. I was no longer the hero. I was the hazard. Acker was scrubbed into a 12-hour Whipple procedure in OR3. I couldn't text her. I couldn't find her. The silence from her end felt heavy, ominous. Doubt, insidious and cold, began to creep in. Was Vance right? Was I a liability? And worse, was I a liability to her? If I went down, would I drag her with me? She was the lead surgeon who had allowed a resident to go rogue. My failure was her failure. I saw her only once, briefly, near the end of my shift. I was coming out of the labs. She was heading toward the elevators, mask marks still indented deep into her cheeks, looking exhausted and ethereal. The hallway was crowded. We couldn't stop. We couldn't speak. But as we passed, the air between us pulled tight, a physical tether snapping into place. She didn't look at me with pity. She didn't look at me with anger. She slowed her pace just enough to catch my eye, her gaze hard, unflinching, and terrifyingly grounded. She gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Hold the line. It was enough to keep me breathing, but barely. The next 48 hours were a blur of legal paperwork and dread. I was suspended pending review. I sat in my apartment, staring at the wall, replaying the surgery 1,000 times, wondering if I had imagined the feel of the vessel, if I really had just been lucky. Then the notification came. The formal review board convened at 0800 hours. The execution was scheduled. I put on my suit, I hid the bruise on my arm, and I walked back into the hospital to face the firing squad. The morbidity and mortality conference room had transformed since the morning. It was no longer just a meeting place. It was an arena. Every seat was filled. The air was heavy with the collective exhale of 50 people waiting to see a career end. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, a defendant in scrubs, while Dr. Vance paced the front of the room like a prosecutor who already knew the verdict. The projector hummed, displaying the post-op scans of the patient I had saved, the patient who was currently alive and recovering in the ICU. But on the screen, Vance had highlighted the clamp site in angry red digital ink, framing my victory as a crime scene. He wasn't shouting. That would have been easier to handle. Instead, he spoke with a terrifying, reasonable calm, a cadence designed to make his cruelty sound like necessary administrative hygiene. "We are not here to debate the outcome," Vance said, tapping the screen with a laser pointer. "We are here to discuss the process." Dr. Alara was given a direct order by the lead surgeon to pack and transfer. She chose to ignore that order. She chose to perform a blind vascular maneuver based on feeling. In this institution, we do not operate on feelings. We operate on facts. He turned to face the room, his eyes sliding over me as if I were a smudge on his lens. This reckless disregard for hierarchy is symptomatic of a deeper issue. We have all seen residents who burn bright and burn out. They mistake adrenaline for skill. They mistake panic for passion. Surgery is not about survival. It is about control. I kept my eyes on the table, my hands clenched in my lap so tight my knuckles were white. I could feel Acker's presence in the room, a gravity well at the other end of the table, but I didn't dare look at her. If I looked at her, I would break. If I looked at her, they would see the connection, the terrified plea in my eyes, and Vance would have the ammunition he needed to destroy us both. Vance walked closer to where I sat, invading my personal space. The smell of his cologne, musk, and expensive tobacco was suffocating. You are distracted, Alara. We all see it. You drift in rounds. You challenge authority because you lack the discipline to understand it. There are rumors of your lack of focus, of your intensity being directed elsewhere. The implication hung in the air, heavy and toxic. He wasn't just calling me incompetent. He was implying I was sleeping around, or that I was too emotional to handle the job. You think you belong here, Vance said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried to the back of the room. But you don't understand the weight of this chair. You don't understand the sacrifice. You see the title, but you don't see the cost. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his eyes cold and dead. Do you even know what it means to carry this department? Do you have any concept of the scars this job leaves on the people who actually lead it? The word scars hit me like a physical blow. The irony was so sharp it tasted like blood. I thought of the silver map on Elena's arm. I thought of the nights I had held her while she shook from the phantom pain of decisions she had to make. I thought of the way she drank her coffee, the way she breathed when she was safe. I knew the scars better than I knew my own name. I knew the cost because I was the one who helped her pay it every single night. But I couldn't say that. I couldn't scream the truth without exposing her to the same fire that was consuming me. So I sat there, swallowing the injustice, letting him paint me as a naive, emotional girl who didn't understand the real world. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, forcing myself to remain silent, to accept the humiliation as the price of her safety. Nothing to say? Vance sneered, straightening up. Typical. No defense for the indefensible. The room was silent, a vacuum where the air used to be. Vance turned back to the board, ready to deliver the final blow, ready to call for the vote that would strip me of my residency. Then, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor tore through the silence. It was loud, deliberate, and violent. Dr. Acker stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, a tectonic shift that instantly realigned the gravity of the room. She didn't slam her hands on the table or raise her voice. She simply rose, and the temperature in the conference room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The silence that followed wasn't the fearful quiet Vance had commanded. It was the vacuum of oxygen leaving the room to fuel a fire. She buttoned her blazer with a single, precise click, a sound that echoed like a bolt sliding home in a rifle. "You are confusing protocol with competence, Dr. Vance," she said. Her voice was low, smooth, and terrifyingly calm. It carried to the corners of the room without effort. "And you are confusing fear with focus." Vance bristled, turning to face her. "I am protecting this hospital's liability, Elena. We cannot have residents throwing clamps into blind fields based on a hunch." "It wasn't a hunch," Acker countered, stepping away from her chair. She walked toward the screen, moving into Vance's territory. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the projection of the patient's anatomy. The retrohepatic space is anatomically constant. The distance between the spinal column and the cava does not change. Dr. Alara didn't guess. She visualized the anatomy in 3 dimensions without needing to open the patient to see it. That isn't luck. That is spatial genius. She turned to the board, her gaze sweeping over the attending surgeons. "We teach them to memorize the textbook. Dr. Alara has memorized the body. If she had followed your protocol, that man would be dead. She didn't deviate because she was panicked. She deviated because she was the only one in the room calm enough to do the math on the blood loss." "She disobeyed a direct order," Vance snapped, losing his composure. From you! Are you telling me you condone insubordination? I condone survival, Acker said, her voice turning to steel. And I condone a surgeon who knows when the rules are writing a death sentence. Vance laughed, a short, incredulous bark. This is absurd. You are twisting logic to defend a mistake. And frankly, Elena, your objectivity here is questionable. We all see it. The favoritism, the leniency. He took a step toward her, dropping his voice to a sneer. You're compromising your integrity for a resident who is clearly distracting you. You asked if she understands the cost? I think she understands exactly how to manipulate the leadership. The air in the room thickened, coiling tight enough to snap. Vance had gone too far. He had insinuated that our relationship was transactional, that I was using her, that she was weak. Acker stopped moving. She stood perfectly still, her profile sharp against the glowing light of the projector. She looked at Vance, really looked at him, with an expression of profound, terrifying clarity. You asked if she understands the cost, Acker repeated softly. You asked if she knows the scars this job leaves. I did, Vance challenged. Does she? Acker turned her head. For the first time, she looked at me. Her eyes weren't guarded anymore. They were open, raw, stripping away the layers of professional distance we had spent months building. In front of 50 people, in front of the board that held our careers, she looked at me with a recognition that burned. Then she looked back at Vance, her voice ringing out with absolute, devastating finality. She knows my scars. The room froze. The silence was absolute. It wasn't just a metaphor. The way she said it, the weight on the word my, the possessive, intimate cadence of it, left no room for interpretation. The implication hit the room like a shockwave. She wasn't talking about emotional baggage. She was talking about the physical reality of her body. She was telling them that I had seen the untouchable chief of surgery stripped of her armor, that I had seen the skin she hid from the world. Vance's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Acker didn't look away. She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a register that was intimate and lethal. She is the only person in this room who knows exactly what it costs to do what I do, because she is the only one who helps me carry it when the doors are closed. You talk about the burden of leadership, Vance. You talk about the toll. You go home to an empty house and a bottle of scotch. She is the one who stitches me back together so I can come in here and clean up your messes. She gestured to me, a hand extended palm up. Not an accusation, but an introduction, a validation. She doesn't just understand the scars, Doctor. She is the only reason I am still standing here to argue with you. So if you want to question her focus, you better be prepared to question mine, because she is the only insider in this room. The rest of you? You're just watching the show. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it evaporated. Vance looked small. He looked like a man who had brought a knife to a nuclear test. He looked at Acker, then at me, and he saw the truth of it, the unbreakable, terrifying strength of the connection he had tried to mock. Acker turned her back on him. She looked at the board chair. Dr. Alara stays, or I go. Choose. She didn't wait for an answer. She walked back to her chair, picked up her file, and looked at me. Come on, Dr. Alara, we have rounds. Vance stood there, the projector light washing him out, a ghost in his own meeting. The silence stretched, heavy and complete. The king was dead, and the queen had just crowned her successor. Walking out of that room felt like leaving a crash site where we were the sole survivors. The adrenaline was still humming in my blood, a high-frequency vibration, but the fear had evaporated. We didn't speak in the hallway. We didn't need to. The hospital staff parted around us like water around a stone, eyes wide, whispers trailing in our wake like exhaust fumes. For the first time in 2 years, I didn't check the corners for Vance's spies. I just matched my stride to hers, the click of our heels on the linoleum falling into a syncopated rhythm that felt less like a retreat and more like a declaration of war. We hit the elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing us in. The silence wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind from the boardroom. It was the silence of a pressure valve finally being released. Elena didn't look at me, but she shifted her stance, her shoulder brushing mine, a deliberate, solid weight. She pressed the button for the parking garage, her hand steady. She had just detonated her professional reputation to save mine, and she looked as calm as she did ordering coffee. "You're breathing too fast," she murmured, watching the floor numbers drop. "You just told the board we're sleeping together," I whispered back. "I told the board you're the only one who matters," she corrected, her voice low. "There's a difference." The doors opened to the concrete gray of the garage. The air was colder here, smelling of gasoline and damp concrete, a sharp relief after the recycled sterility of the upper floors. We walked to her car, the sleek black sedan that fit her perfectly, understated power, expensive engineering. Inside, the world went quiet. The heavy thud of the door closing shut out the hospital, shut out Vance. She started the engine, the dashboard lighting up in soft amber, but she didn't pull out immediately. She sat there, gripping the leather steering wheel, her knuckles white. The performance was over. The armor was cracking, just a hairline fracture. She let out a breath, a long, shaky exhale that fogged the air between us. "You didn't have to do that," I said, my voice sounding small in the enclosed space. "You could have fought him on the medicine. You didn't have to give him us." She turned to me then. The dashboard lights cast shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp line of her jaw. "He wasn't attacking the medicine, Alara. He was attacking you. He was trying to make you small. And I wasn't going to let him." "But the cost," I argued. "Your reputation." "The board needs me more than I need them," she said simply, putting the car in gear. "And I need you more than I need this job." That was the calculation. It wasn't a risk. It was a trade. She pulled out, the tires squealing softly. The drive was a blur of city lights streaking past the windows, neon signs bleeding into long lines of color. I watched her profile as she drove. She operated the car like she operated in the OR, efficient, decisive, anticipating the traffic before it happened. But her hand, the one resting on the gear shift, kept drifting toward me, then pulling back, a muscle memory of restraint she was trying to unlearn. Finally, she reached out. She didn't look away from the road, but her hand found mine in the darkness between the seats. Her fingers laced through mine, her grip tight, almost painful. It was a desperate, grounding touch. I squeezed back, feeling the calluses on her fingertips, the strength in her palm. We were connected, a closed circuit in the rushing dark. "He was right about one thing," she said quietly, her thumb tracing the back of my hand. "The scars. He thinks they're a weakness. He thinks trauma makes you brittle." "He's wrong," I said. "I know," she replied, "because you touched them and I didn't break." The tension in the car shifted. It wasn't fear anymore. It was anticipation, a thick, coiled heat that started in my chest and spread downward. The public defense had been a turn-on, a display of dominance and protection that wired straight into my nervous system. But this quiet claim in the dark, her hand holding mine while the city blurred past, was something else. It was intimacy. It was the promise that the performance was over and the real conversation was about to begin. We turned onto her street. The garage door rumbled open, revealing the sanctuary inside. The car rolled to a stop, the engine cut. The sudden silence was deafening. "We're home," she whispered. And for the first time, the word didn't just mean a place. It meant her. The house was the antithesis of the hospital. Where St. Jude's was cold chrome and fluorescent glare, Elena's sanctuary was warm amber light, soft textiles, and the faint, lingering scent of sandalwood and old books. The moment the lock turned, the tension that had held her spine straight for 12 hours finally snapped. She didn't walk in. She collapsed inward, leaning back against the heavy oak door as if her legs had suddenly remembered they were human. I watched the lead surgeon dissolve, replaced by the woman who was simply, exhaustingly, Elena. She dropped her keys on the console table, a sharp clatter that sounded like a surrender. "I'm tired," she whispered, the admission rough and unpolished. "I know," I said. I moved into her space, not as a subordinate, but as the partner she had just claimed in front of the world. My hands found the lapels of her blazer, sliding the fabric off her shoulders. It fell to the floor, ignored. Next came the silk blouse, the buttons slipping through my fingers with a familiarity that felt sacred. She remained still, head tipped back against the wood, eyes closed as I stripped away the armor she wore for everyone else. When the layers were gone, the truth was visible. The scars weren't just a metaphor Vance used to taunt her. They were a map written on her skin. The jagged, silvery line on her shoulder, the faint tracks across her ribs from the surgeries that had saved her life years ago. In the boardroom, she had used them as a weapon. Here, in the quiet dimness of the hallway, they were an invitation. I traced the line on her deltoid with my fingertips, feeling the ridge of raised tissue. She shivered, a full-body tremor that had nothing to do with the temperature. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat as my hand moved lower, mapping the history of her pain. My palm skimmed the smooth skin of her waist, feeling the heat radiating off her, the pulse jumping under her jaw. "He asked if you knew the cost," she murmured, her eyes opening. They were dark, dilated, fixed on mine with an intensity that burned. "This is the cost." "I know," I whispered, stepping closer until our bodies brushed, skin against skin, heat against heat. "And it's beautiful." "It's ugly," she countered, but she didn't pull away. She leaned into my touch, her hands coming up to grip my waist, pulling me flush against her. "It's broken." "It's healed," I corrected. I leaned up, pressing a kiss to the scar on her shoulder, then another to the pulse point at her throat, feeling the frantic rhythm of her heart against my lips. "And it's mine." The air in the hallway thickened, charged with the same electric static that had filled the scrub room. But this time, there were no cameras, no Vance, no protocols to stop us. Her grip on my waist tightened, her nails digging in, possessive and desperate. This wasn't just desire, it was a need to be anchored. She had spent the day being the pillar that held up the sky. Now, she needed to be the one held. "You're the only one," she breathed against my lips, her voice breaking. "The only one who sees this. The only one allowed." "I'm not going anywhere," I promised. She kissed me then, not with the careful restraint of the parking garage, but with a starving, reckless hunger. It was a kiss that tasted of relief and victory. We stumbled backward, moving blindly toward the bedroom, the politics of the hospital dissolving into the simple, undeniable physics of two bodies that fit perfectly together. The world outside could think what it wanted. They could whisper about favoritism and protocol. In here, in the dark, we knew the truth. I wasn't her subordinate. I was her sanctuary. Hours later, the house was silent. I lay awake, watching the rise and fall of her chest, the moonlight tracing the silver lines on her arm that draped over my waist. Vance had tried to use her history to break us, to shame her vulnerability. He hadn't realized that the cracks are where the light gets in, and where the iron is welded strongest. If you understand the power of a connection that defies the rules, subscribe to see where our story goes next. She knew my heart, and I knew her scars. That was enough.